Congratulations, you have made it through the section on building an API in raw Node.js with no libraries and no frameworks. Bravo. All the rest of the sections of this course should be a lot easier for you. If this was challenging, don't worry, it just gets easier from here. But if you made it through this section, you should be very proud of yourself. So now, before we move on, we're going to go over all the Node libraries and modules that we used in this lecture series, in this section, so that you can start to familiarize yourself with the Node documentation a little bit, and also just recap what we did. This, if you haven't seen it before, is the Node.js documentation that's available on their website. By the time you're viewing this, this might change a little bit. Just make sure that you are viewing Node version 8 point something. Right now, the LTS release of Node is 8.9.4, but that could bump up a minor or patch version number at any time. In no particular order, one of the modules that we used in this lecture series was command line options. Command line options is what we were just speaking about in the last lecture. The fact that we were able to start Node with environmental variables such as node_debug allowed us to get our logging under control so that we weren't logging tons of things to the console. There's also a whole bunch of other command line options that you can start Node with, and we'll explore a few of these as time goes on. Another module that we use was console for the same reason. We did console.log a lot, and you learned that you can pass different kinds of arguments to console.log in order to change the color. There's also a whole bunch of other things that you can do with console.log, or use other console functions such as .count or .error, .group. Another module that we used was crypto. If you remember when we were creating the user service, when we would post to users, we would have to hash their password. And for that, we use the crypto module. It's built in create HMAC, and SHA-256 functions allowed us to hash those passwords and also hash them again in the token service when we needed to compare a sent password to one that we had stored. Another module that we used in this section was file system, which we refer to as FS. FS allowed us to read from the file system, write to the file system, open files, truncate files, unlink files, and a whole bunch of other things synchronously and asynchronously. FS is a very useful module, and if you're building applications in Node, this will probably be one that you're using perhaps more than any other. Globals. Globals is another module that we did not ever have to require because, as its name implies, globals is just a collection of things that become globally available to you. If you remember, when we were creating base directories, we used __ directory name a lot in order to resolve our path or create a long path that could be resolved later. We also did module.exports within our file in order to export the contents of a file into another one that was requiring it. Speaking of require is another global, and require allows us to import the contents of one file into another. So all these globals have been important to us as we've been using them, and as you use Node, you'll use the other globals available as well. Two modules that we used at the beginning when we were just setting up our HTTP and HTTPS servers were, as the name implies, the HTTP module and the HTTPS module. These ones allowed us to create new servers, listen on ports. HTTPS allowed us to listen on ports securely with self-signed SSL certificates. But remember that HTTP and HTTPS also allowed us to create and craft HTTP requests that could be sent to HTTP or HTTPS endpoints in order for us to perform our checks and actually check whether these URLs configured by the users were up or down. So HTTP and HTTPS are very useful, both for listening for HTTP connections and making outbound HTTP requests as well. there is a module which is actually just called modules. Now, this is kind of a meta module that you never really use yourself. It's really just documenting the fact that modules, the ability to require, import different functions that are scoped to whatever variable you assign them, that whole thing exists and is part of the Node experience. That's all encapsulated in this module. So in a way, just by using Node and doing requiring, you have used this module. If you remember, when we were setting up the data library as well as the logging library, we used path a lot. We were using path in order to resolve our path and normalize it and make it clean enough to be able to read in a certificate or write to a file system in a coherent way. Another module was process. If you remember, process.env was one of the globals that we access in order to determine what command line options have been sent to us when this app got started up. And so there are other process.globals that you can use. .env is just one example, but the way that we use .env, you can use the others as well. Query strings. Query strings is a module that we used early on and then more recently when we needed to take a URL that was full of path and query string parameters and explode it into a more coherent object that separated out the host name from the path and the query string. We used that when we were originally taking in HTTP requests with the server, and then more recently when we were making HTTP requests out from us to whatever URL that we wanted to check. String decoder is something that we used early on in order to get the payload parsed that the users had been sending in and parse it as UTF-8. String decoder isn't really used that often, but when you do use it, such as for parsing an incoming payload into a buffer, it's extremely useful. Another module that we've been using, especially in the workers, is timers. Timers is another module that we don't need to require explicitly. It just exposes some globals to us, similar to the kind of globals that get exposed in the browser as it pertains to timing. That is set interval, set timeout, and a few others. We've been using set interval when it comes to making sure our workers fire every minute or every hour, as it were. Another module that we used early on is URL when it came to parsing out the host name, the path name, etc. from the URL. We used the URL module and brought in some query string module usage as well. Utilities. More recently, we just used the util.debug log functions in order to set up that node_debug regime where we can use that startup command line option in order to say which things should be console logged and which things should not. The utility class has a bunch of other really useful functions in there. It also has a bunch of deprecated things that you should probably stay away from unless you're already using them. Another library that we didn't need to require, but we did use, was buffers. If you remember when we were compressing and decompressing a file, for example, we were moving from a string into a buffer and then back to a string. And similarly, when we were decoding that same file, we went from a base64 string up into a new buffer and then back to a plain text string. Buffers are really useful. It's really how Node thinks of or represents streaming data, payload data, such as when we did HTTP, incoming payloads, and you'll be using them a lot. The zlib module is something that we only used during the log compression and decompression lecture. Zlib provides a few useful functions and different options for zipping, inflating, gzipping, deflating, etc. So if you need to compress data, look no further than the zlib module. Lastly, as I mentioned, we have been using the streaming module, especially as it pertains to the incoming payload that we are parsing when users make a request or a post with a JSON payload. We stream it in a little bit at a time as opposed to trying to read it all at one time. So that is all of the Node modules that we used in this section. It was a whole bunch of them. And in the next sections, we will slowly use all of these remaining modules, or at least mention why you wouldn't want to use them or why you would want to use them. We'll eventually at least address in passing all of the modules listed here. And after each section in our lecture series, we will return to this documentation and talk about which modules we just went over. This is so that you, after you finish this course, can look at this Node.js documentation and quickly identify what buffer is, what console is, what file system is, etc. So without further ado, we can move on to the next whole section in this course, which is about building a web app front end for this RESTful API that we just built on the back end. So we've been spending a whole bunch of time on the back end, and now we get to do some front end stuff. Although, since it's Node.js, of course, there's still going to be a lot of what feels like back-end work involved.